Hey, Hound Dogs, I'm David Hankins,
And I'm Paul Hankins.
And I'm Trevor Hankins.
and welcome to On the Air with Power Squared. If you were tuning in to see us interview Steve Laffler, he had to cancel at the last moment. We'll reschedule him probably sometime in November.
Yeah.
So looking forward to having the conversation, but we have to sort of pivot to a new topic.
Yeah.
So,
Since it's of the season, I figured we could talk about horror. I'd actually consider doing that as like a bonus on Halloween, but the opportunity opened up here.
Yep.
We were trying to figure out what direction to go in, and then we realized we had Frankenstein on the brain. And that we actually had a bit to talk about with that, like material-wise.
Yeah, so we thought we would spend the show talking about Frankenstein.
Yes.
So, hope you've, if you've seen or haven't seen, hope you enjoy it. So, we want to start with the Frankenstein that everybody knows, which is sadly not the book, but the movie Frankenstein from Universal, 1931.
Yeah. With Boris Karloff as the monster.
Yes, or as question mark as the monster. Is it
Yeah.
what I have in there? Which is really not a retelling of the book. It's based on the book, but not really a strict follow the book.
Yeah.
It's based on the idea of the book.
Yeah,
Yes.
it takes elements of the book and does its own thing with it. From my understanding of what happened in the book.
Right. We have not read Mary Shelley's book.
No, but my understanding of what happens in the book, it does, again, it takes some plot elements, but puts its own spin on it, and the universal interpretation of Frankenstein is also what most people think of when they talk about Frankenstein, including like the lightning, the bolts on the neck.
Right. That's so you can jumpstart him, right?
Yeah. And the windmill scene.
Right. So, and then you find that people a lot of times will be remaking the story they know, not the story that it's based on.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of interpretations of Frankenstein that are basically based on the Universal
Yeah.
movie. So the original book dates to 1818.
Yeah.
Mary Shelley wrote it when she was 18, published it when she was 20, which is just, it's really, to have write a book that young that is still being talked about, especially on this show. It's quite an accomplishment. You have to give credit to that.
Yeah.
And that's a little more, one of the things we were talking about, we're not huge scare horror fans,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
speaking for
Yeah,
all
or at
three of
least
us.
not huge experts in.
Yeah, and we're not trying to pretend that we're just like on any time we talk about something, even Power Squared. We're not experts,
Yeah.
but we do watch a lot of movies. We also write reviews of movies,
Yeah.
and we sort of wanted to cross pollinate with Trophy Unlocked,
TrophyUnlocked.blogspot.com.
where we have reviewed a couple of the movies that we'll be talking about and some of the stories that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Basically, I gather that the Frankenstein story, more than being, and if you watch that movie now, it is 90 years old, and it's not going to really scare you,
No.
unless you're a small child, I guess.
Yeah, it's very tame by today's standards.
Yes,
Yeah.
but I imagine back then, the fact that you were dealing with, somebody recreating life and the blasphemy of being God and all that, I'm sure it was a little more resonant. But I don't know how many people were really frightened by these movies all these horror movies that Universal did when they came out.
Yeah. I mean, unless we maybe like look at reviews of the time or somehow figure out what people were saying then, we're not really sure, so we can only assume that it was scarier to an audience back then.
Yeah, and this was the second of the horror films that Universal made, the first being Dracula,
Yeah.
which came out, I believe it was Valentine's Day,
Yeah.
1931. So they were trying to, brand themselves as sort of a horror And I took a class about film history one time, and the teacher was talking about all these horror films they made, and there are lots of them. There's 4 or 5 Frankensteins and 4 or 5 Dracula sequels.
Yeah.
That we would call them now. And he was saying that they always figured there were crazy people out there that would like them, so they just kept making them. So anyway, so Frankenstein is probably a lot of people's first exposure. The movie Frankenstein.
Yeah. I would say the movie is still worth watching because of how much influence it has on later media.
Right, and you're seeing sort of I guess the birth of the stardom of Boris Karloff.
Yeah.
He was sort of a bit player in Hollywood and up until then, and that was this big breakthrough for him.
Yeah.
And you see him again in more horror films like The Mummy and things like that. He sort of became a little synonymous with horror the same way Bela Lugosi did. And for Boris Karloff's sake, he was actually able to make other movies, but Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi seemed to be a little more trapped in horror.
Yeah, like typecast.
Yeah. So we don't get off on that's a whole different story talking about Dracula.
Yes.
So yes, it's a good film for the time.
Yeah.
It does have some of the resonance of the book.
Yeah.
As I understand it, and it's not quite though as it's not a jump scare kind of thing really. Yeah. It's just oh my god, you created a creature.
Yeah.
That does go on a rampage a little bit, and then people's reacting to it, and that is I know is probably key in Shelley's Frankenstein is how people react to the monster.
Yeah.
And as you see, anytime there's an alien movie and aliens land, there's all these guys with shotguns, let's go kill it, and then it was probably pitchforks and torches. They were the same thing. It's fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
So, but it's not as, I don't think it's psychological necessarily as the book probably is.
Yeah.
She was more Victorian, and I assume it's more of a psychological thriller for her.
Yeah. So the Universal movie also had 4 sequels.
Right.
Bride of Frankenstein from 35, Son of Frankenstein in 39, Ghost of Frankenstein in 42, and House of Frankenstein in 44.
So, as we were talking a little bit, Bride of Frankenstein is sort of continuing the Frankenstein book.
Yeah. It takes another element of the book that, from our understanding anyway, that didn't take up a whole. It was part of the story. It was a significant part of the story, but it didn't take up that much space comparatively. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no.
And but took that and made a whole movie out of it.
So one of what kind of prompted this idea we could do Frankenstein was I happened to hear, and then we played it last night for everybody.
Yeah.
A radio play from 1931, so it's a 90-year-old play of a show called A Witch's Tale with was it Old Nancy and her cat Satan.
Yes.
Really bad sound effect for the cat. And they told the story of Frankenstein in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And covered, there's always with those kind of condensations, there's this idea that you must know the story or be familiar with it.
Yeah.
This came out about 3 months before the movie. And it tried to tell the book, I think, closer.
Yeah.
And gotten a little more of this, I think, the psychological nature of it.
Yeah.
Because you've got a monster, or the creature, who, well, basically you have Dr. Frankenstein playing God.
Yes.
And being and thinking that he's improved on God's work, and he creates this creature that he thinks is going to be this beautiful superhuman, and it turns kind of into this. In the radio play, it was when he's animating it, it sort of shrivels up and becomes gross,
grotesque.
Yeah, and he freaks out about it, and so, and then he thinks the creature's, he goes crazy for a little while, and then the creature returns and can speak English and is well read, apparently, and stuff like that. Which I don't think the movie doesn't really get into very much, being well read.
In the Universal movie, the Universal interpretation of Frankenstein, the monster is more nonverbal.
Right. And as in Young Frankenstein, it's an abnormal brain or whatever. He's a criminal brain that makes him kind of that way. But in the book, he's thinking he's created this brain that will absorb everything and become this, not only strong and impenetrable by the cold and all that sort of stuff, but also be really smart and be able to pick up everything really fast. So he thinks he's invented this kind of a superhuman.
Yeah.
And that goes sideways pretty quick. But what I liked about it, at least the radio play, which I assume is in the book, was the feeling of you've got the creature loves and hates his creator.
Yeah.
He's the only person that he knows is Dr. Frankenstein, who loathes him, and at the same time he loves Dr. Frankenstein in return for giving him sort of birth.
Yeah, that is from our understanding pretty much how it happens in the or that relationship is there in the original story.
Right. So I think that's something that's not really so much in the movie.
Yeah.
They kind of blip past the psychological side of it.
Yeah, no. So based up, kind of going back to this, do we have any thoughts on how Bride of Frankenstein was?
Well, as I understand it, and you guys have read a book that's closer to an adaptation to the original.
Yeah.
But my understanding is in the book, the monster wants a mate.
Yeah.
He feels like he's the only person that doesn't have a mate. This is before, identification.
Yeah, the monster is in the original story, the monster is lonely because he can't find love with humanity.
Right.
So he wants the doctor to create a bride for him,
right.
And she would be just as grotesque as him, so she would have, I guess, kind of no choice but to be with him.
Right. And the doctor is, of course, resistant to that idea because he doesn't want to create a bunch of monsters that are going to wipe humanity off the face of the earth. Of course, in the radio play.
Yeah. And
when he refuses to create the Bride of Frankenstein, the monster killed his bride, Elizabeth, which I don't think that's not happened in the movie.
Yeah, I don't remember that happening in the movie.
You wouldn't have had, but they probably wouldn't have done that in Hollywood films. They kill people off like that, probably. And then that sets up this chase thing, which I assume is in the book, between the monster and Dr. Frankenstein. I'm going to get you, and you're not going to, kind of a deal.
Yeah, in the original story, the doctor chases Frankenstein until they end up in the Arctic.
Right. And they again, there's a sort of love-hate relationship with them.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I was just agreeing.
Okay. And in the radio play, the doctor is ill from having chased him and been out on the ice for several days, and is going to die. And the monster sneaks aboard the ship that he's on, and they talk, and he carries him for them both to jump into the water and drown. I don't know if that's how the book ends or
the book. From what we saw or what we've read, the book I think the book ends a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's a similar idea, but in the version that we read, the Frankenstein dies. The monster senses that and decides that he will die there as well.
Okay. So it's a similar end it together kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Kind of a little Romeo and Juliet, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Sort of.
Yeah. So I mean, that kind of relationship is as old as the stories.
Yeah.
But yeah. So So the movie, though, it tells a different take on it, and I guess Bride of Frankenstein sort of tries to cover that other little gap in it.
Covers that arc of the manga.
Yes, I'm sure that was her idea. So, and then I believe Hammer made a Frankenstein.
Yeah.
And Andy Warhol made a Frankenstein.
Yeah, and of course there have been countless reinterpretations of Frankenstein.
I saw a
over the
play
years.
once called about the thing called Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From your understanding, is the Hammer version based on the Universal movie or based on the book?
My understanding is that Universal, at one point, because there's also Dracula and the Mummy and all those, is they gave them a license to remake their films.
Right, so it's more based on the movie.
Yeah, and then I assumed this would have been a part of how Universal was going to relaunch the monster universe.
Yeah,
and I assume Frankenstein would have been in there.
likely.
Look how that turned out.
Yeah, well, it's a gross miscalculation.
Yeah,
And trying to, I think part of the problem is they started off with the Mummy.
Yeah.
And didn't really follow the Mummy that you knew. They kind of modernized it. I think part of the charm of these movies is that they're set kind of when she wrote the book.
Yeah.
So you have sort of a mindset of people in that time going, wow, a creature, that would be really scary, or like the Invisible Man.
Yeah.
It would be hard to
It
understand.
also gives it kind of a interesting timeless effect.
Right. So modernizing it to, I want to say it was probably the Afghan War or Iraqi War or something, and starting it from there, kind of, it dates it already in a way.
Yeah.
And then you don't really tell the story that people know. So they tried to they made a Mummy and the Mummy Returns, or two Mummy films earlier. So you just have to kind of stick with, either go back to the source material or stick with the story that people know. And I think that's kind of where Universal got off. And then they try to tie them all together by some sort of,
Yeah.
And none of these movies really. I mean, I know that Universal, made the Dracula meets the Mummy and Dracula, meets Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Frankenstein meets the wolf me.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was just cross, promotion or pollination or whatever you want to call it, trying to do that. And it is if you've watched those movies, they're kind of silly.
Yeah.
So the idea of taking that silliness and branding it as a big, huge, monster verse was, I think, part of the problem they had.
Before we pivot back to just talking about Frankenstein, I will say that at some point I would be interested in seeing Brendan Fraser's The Mummy, because I know there's like a lot of nostalgia for that movie.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen the animated adaptation.
Yeah. But going back to Frankenstein.
Okay, if you insist.
So with the Universal catalog, the other sequel that we at least remember the story of was Son of Frankenstein.
Right.
Which I guess you could see it determined as kind of a sequel to the general story.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it involves Frankenstein, as the title probably says, it's Frankenstein's son, and it's him dealing with the legacy left behind by his father, and how people don't trust him.
Right. And yeah, and so obviously Elizabeth survived.
Yeah.
The movies, at least, to have the kid. That gets into sort of an interesting, I don't know where you want to go next, but there's a movie that may be other people's introduction to it, which is sort of parodying the whole group of films called Young Frankenstein, which was started out as a Gene Wilder idea, and Mel Brooks sort of took it over, as I understand it. And it basically, one of the cool things about it is that they went back and recreated the sets that were used in the original film, which is pretty cool. And it's amazing that Universal would still have them, I guess, because everybody seemed to sell off everything at some point. But basically it parodies the Son of Frankenstein and gets into the whole Frankenstein's monster and the Bride of Frankenstein as well.
Yeah.
So it's kind of
mishmash.
Yeah, but it's pretty funny.
Yeah, it really is. And I think I remember last time we saw Son of Frankenstein, I realized, wait a minute, young Frankenstein is Son of Frankenstein with jokes.
To a certain degree.
Not that that's a bad thing.
No.
Just that it borrowed the structure very heavily from Son of Frankenstein.
Right. Or Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Frankenstein.
Yeah. Yeah.
Igor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Walk like this. I can walk like that. Yeah, there's a lot. It's a very funny and parody of the whole thing,
Yeah.
and very enjoyable.
Yeah.
And I think they kind of play with some of the other stuff, but
Yeah, I'd recommend Mel Brooks movie.
yeah, and that's actually maybe one of the better Mel Brooks movies.
Yeah.
You know, the producers in that probably I think are the best he's done. I know some people say Blazing Saddles, but that's kind of just a big fart joke.
More or less. While we're on the subject, I guess while we're on the subject of parody, there was also Franken Thumb, which was part of a, I guess you could say, Thumb series of
parodies.
Yeah.
I remember it's been like a long time since we saw that, but I remember it was really funny.
Yeah.
Like can't like laugh out loud, funny pretty much all the way through.
Yeah. The torches.
Yeah. And then it
Which
has
were matches, as I recall.
yeah. No, I want to say it was of course based more on the Universal take on it.
Mm-hmm.
But that was okay because like it's a quick parody, so it's just.
Well, those Thumb movies were basically takeoffs of movies.
Yeah.
So it makes sense they would do a
Universal
right.
Frankenstein.
Yeah.
And it did its own
Torches.
yeah. its own take on different elements was funny again from the last time I remember.
Yeah,
watching
and I
it.
think I got a little into the one of the things that I know is a parody or is brought up in Young Frankenstein is the kind of the police officer with the weird hand and stuff, and that's more in the other movies.
Yeah.
It's not in the original movie, as far as I remember, but I think it's like in Son of Frankenstein, you get the guy with the and that's parodied and I believe that's also in Thumb.
Yeah.
So.
And then it also brings up, probably because of like with Franken Thumb, I also remember probably because it was part of that series. It also brought Batman in there somehow.
Oh,
Yes.
well, they did a Batman one. They did
Yeah.
Titanic. And
Yeah,
they did some-
but I mean, Batman kind of came back in Franken Thumb.
Yes, he did. Yes. Yes.
Frankenbata.
Yeah.
In it works in the context.
If you take that as the Thumb universe.
Yeah.
You know.
The Thumb
Thumbverse.
cinematic universe.
Yes, the Thumbverse. The TCU.
Anyway, it's clear how much of an influence through. I'll just hold these up again. Through these, it's clear that the Universal movie has had a big impact on how people viewed that story and how it gets reinterpreted.
Right.
Of course, there are other takes on that story, but go actually in their own direction.
Okay.
Like 1900s. Oh, and Lovecraft was around. He did his own take. He kind of did his own take on Frankenstein called Herbert West Reanimator.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's been years since I read it. I read the story, so I don't quite remember all the details. But I do remember some of the commentary that this book that I have had about it. And I mentioned it was originally serialized.
Okay.
And Lovecraft, I want to say, didn't think too highly of it because, or it's considered not one of his stronger stories, partly because he did it for the money.
Mm-hmm.
And it was notable how many similarities that the elements had to Frankenstein, but of course it had still elements of Lovecraft's own world in it, like Miskatonic University, and it didn't have like the Elder God stuff that he's really known for, but it had his brand of his brand of horror.
Okay. Now, they made a movie of that.
Yes. Reanimator.
With Jeffrey Combs.
Yeah, Jeffrey Combs.
Right.
Who I guess was known for horror stuff.
Okay.
If I remember correctly. Or we saw the movie. It was like okay, I guess.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah. Something Trevor and I were actually talking about earlier was unless you want to tell the story, it's like when they were making the movie, the crew was taking it seriously, but the composer saw it as a farce, so he composed it as such. And then when they were reviewing the movie, the crew was realized that it was unintentionally a farce, so they just kind of went with it. They got unintentionally silly at times.
Right, but it's also it's more in the I'll say creepy variety of horror. I mean, it does things that you would, it has a lot of blood and gore and
when it goes more into body horror.
Yeah, and then there's a whole thing with I won't get into with father and daughter, but it's which is more modern.
Yeah.
We tend to see, for a time, movies got to be really, because, there was no longer the production code that made things sort of sanitized. They would just go crazy.
Yeah.
And movies got more and more bloody and gory and, intestinal. What? Yeah, because you could. There's no way to stop you from doing it.
At some point, people are like overcompensating.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
For sure.
People that weren't being tied back by the are being upset. So yeah, that movie kind of goes, I'll say, over the top.
Yeah. Again, the practical effects look fine. The acting was alright. Probably Jeffrey Combs was the best one from what I remember. Overall, it's I guess decent. Maybe. I can't quite remember exactly. So don't take my impromptu thoughts on it as our full opinion of it. I think we have a review of it.
We do have a review of that, and I know of Frankenstein on the blog.
Yeah.
Which I'll have a link to in the video.
Yeah. So then Tim Burton had his take called Frankenweenie.
Right.
There was a live-action short film.
Yes.
Which I believe you can view on the Night Before Christmas DVD.
This one right here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on there because Tim Burton, so they shoved some of his other stuff on there.
Uh-huh.
One of them was live-action Frankenweenie. So then they made a full-length stop-motion.
Yeah,
stop-motion Frankenweenie. We've watched it, but we haven't reviewed it.
Right.
I was trying to remember if the Frankenstein story is actually part of any motivation in the movie.
I don't quite remember.
But anyway, it has the general idea of reanimation.
Right.
Yeah.
But what's different is, I mean, with Frankenstein's monster, he's a kind of a conglomerate of parts.
Yeah.
And what I gathered from the radio play, that it's also like there's animal parts in there too. It's not just all humans, because he took stuff from the slaughterhouse and all that kind of stuff to make this creature. That is basically just reanimating your dead dog, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's a little different take.
It gets into reanimating pets because they're realize like, hey, this kid can bring back the dead.
Right.
And then they kind of pressure him into continuing to do it until it gets out of control.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah. So maybe one day we'll review it.
Yes, we'll have to watch it again.
But I remember it was alright.
Yeah.
For those who are curious, if I recall, both the live action and the stop motion are on Disney Plus.
Yes, they are.
Because Disney needs a plug from us. So I'm glad we give that to them. And if they would return the favor, that'd be swell.
So anyway, those are two different reinterpretations of at least the same kind of story.
Right.
And then recently, Trevor and I read a manga adaptation of the original book by Junji Ito.
Okay. You guys want to talk about that?
Sure. I also mentioned that despite the thickness of the book, it's a collection of Junji Ito stories. And Frankenstein does have the biggest page count of the whole thing, but the rest of it is must be like pretty much a dozen other stories.
So tell us.
Yeah, there's a bunch in there.
So who is this guy that?
Junji Ito?
Yeah.
Okay, Junji Ito is a famous horror mangaka.
Okay.
He has works like Uzumaki, Enigma of... God, I'm not going to remember this name. It was like Amigawa Fault.
Something like that.
I won't know.
Yeah. Feel free to correct me in the comments.
Yeah.
So anyway, he has these famous horror stories. I believe Uzumaki is actually getting an animated adaptation
For Tsunami.
Yeah. And Junji Ito was actually going to be the monster designer for Silent Hills.
Okay.
Just as a small bit of information.
He makes a cameo in Death Stranding.
Yeah.
So he's still alive?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is he still going?
Good for him.
So anyway, we got interested in because of his reputation. We were curious about how he would interpret the Frankenstein story.
So we got this collection just to read that story.
Yeah. And one of the selling points was actually that that version of Frankenstein was closer to the book. So that is our idea of what happens in the book.
Okay.
And it's actually the actual story from the book is actually very interesting and engaging in its own right.
Okay.
And Junji Ito's artwork does a really good job of tapping into the physical and psychological horror element of it.
It's probably him calling right now.
That is the phone.
We're doing, even in the studio, the phone goes off. No, okay.
Yeah, anyway. So there is some body horror in it, but it's not over the top. It's just enough.
Okay.
It's more from what I know of Junji Ito, it's a more subdued Junji Ito.
Okay.
Yeah. And he has a very interesting take on the monster that you wouldn't see in like other versions of the story.
Okay. So you have something you want to show us, Trevor, from the book?
Should I throw that up on screen?
Yeah.
Sure. This is the first appearance of the monster.
Yeah.
Wow.
It actually taps into the more of the, from what little I read of what's in the book, the physical description of the monster in there. And it captures more of the patchwork nature.
Right.
Yeah.
One interesting major difference between the original story and the Universal movie is that the story feels more personal to the Doctor.
Okay.
Like the monster does get run out by humanity because they fear him, but most of the horror is related directly more to what happens to Frankenstein and how the creation of the monster affects his own life.
Is there I had a question I was going to ask, and now I've totally lost what I was going to ask about but it was about the story.
Right.
Get back to me later. Sorry. One of those things we had it on the tip of my tongue and away.
Junji Ito also, from my understanding, had his own take on the female creature subplot.
Okay.
Yes.
Probably a spoiler alert. In the Junji Ito story, Frankenstein is convinced to go through with it, and he actually succeeds in creating a female creature.
Okay.
However, even the female creature is horrified by the first monster, and she basically goes crazy and ends up getting killed.
Okay.
So that ends up being a motivator for the creature trying to basically ruin Frankenstein's life.
Okay, that again, I imagine the radio play that I heard probably cut out stuff that fit it into 30 minutes. It was 2 15-minute shows, so they probably took that part out.
Yeah.
But that makes a lot more sense in a lot of ways.
And so I guess the Junji Ito story, probably because it more closely follows the original story, it's tragic, like I'll say even more so than other adaptations. It's the story is tragic not just for Frankenstein, but you also end up, even though the monster ends up wanting to ruin Frankenstein's life, you do feel actually sorry for him.
Right. He didn't ask to be born.
Yeah.
Or create it.
Yeah. So it brings out more of the tragic element of what happens with the monster.
Okay. Huh. All right. Sounds like a fairly interesting read.
Yeah. Again, that's not to say like the universal version doesn't tap into the tragic element of the monster, but
they make him out to be more of a outsider and the creature and to be feared.
Yeah.
Because he does, like, thinking of the Frankenstein with the guy talking with the Italian accent, but he does, like, kill the little girl, and he's kind of, he's not, as I say, I think in Young Frankenstein they try to answer that question with the abnormal brain, that Igor collects.
Yeah.
Something different.
Okay.
For those who are curious, these are the other stories in this collection.
Yeah.
She really, honestly, I don't think people will be able to read it unless they have a really big screen.
Right, well, I'll just pause.
But if you can read it, that'd be great.
Yeah.
All right. So, anything else we want to talk about related to Frankenstein and our vast knowledge of the subject?
Was there something you wanted to ask, or did you already ask it?
The question I was going to ask, I forgot.
Okay.
And it just happens.
Okay. So,
do you have okay, so let's just say, do you have a favorite of the tellings of Frankenstein that we've watched or read or heard?
Well, based on recent experience, one of my favorites would be the Junji Ito version.
Okay.
Which is incidentally the only Junji Ito story we've ever actually read.
Okay.
Yeah. And as for other interpretations, the original Universal one is still pretty good.
Right. Yeah, there's I know that one better, and I do appreciate supposedly, like, it took a long time to do the makeup, and it was lead-based makeup, which isn't good for you.
Yeah.
And I guess they worked on it I saw a thing on TCM recently where they were talking about to his daughter about all he went through, and basically it took like months or weeks or something to come up with the makeup for it. And it was a long, arduous putting it on every day.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't let him eat lunch at the commissary because he would scare other people.
Hmm.
Yeah. So.
As for like parodies, I would probably say maybe Young Frankenstein.
Right. And of course, Frankenstein was pretty funny. All right. Well, I think we kind of covered that. So hopefully you're having you'll pick one of those movies for your Halloween enjoyment.
Yes.
Right? And or you can read our reviews where?
TrophyUnlocked.blogspot.com.
All right.
If you're watching this on YouTube later, and you like this conversation, leave a like, subscribe, and consider ringing that notification bell. And if you have any thoughts of your own on Frankenstein, leave them down in the comments below.
All right. So next time, I'm David Hankins.
I'm Paul Hankins.
I'm Trevor Hankins.
And you've been on the air with Power Squared.